was sandwiched between my colleagues, Dr. Marzouk and President Lapsley, so thanks for that. It's on, yep. So we'll get started. Last week we covered the futures of preaching. We covered it all in about an hour, so you're now educated and ready to forecast the future of worship, and we're going to do the same with preaching this morning. Congratulations. So I don't know if you've heard, but the church is changing and shifting these days. There are no shortage of questions about the church and its survival, no shortage of finger pointing and blaming, and no shortage of pressure points on what people think might just bring vitality and life to the church that is, quite frankly, struggling to live up to the dreams of what it once was in American life. Whether or not we should try to live up to the ghosts of the church in the past is a different question for a different day. But one of those pressure points is most certainly preaching. People who show up to church week after week for the first time show up because of the preaching that happens in a congregation. And I don't just say that because I'm a preaching professor. That's what polls and studies tell us. So from the outside, we might think that there are demands to shake up the look, the sound, the feel, and the practice of preaching. And maybe that's true. So what are some of the futures of preaching in the 21st century? Well, I would love to, as I said last week, would love to prognosticate and let you know that I have all the answers for a singular future of preaching in the 21st century, but I am unable to do that. And so instead, here is what I will affirm here at the outset. There are multiple futures for preaching, plural. These futures are contextual. That is to say, what happens in preaching will depend on the demands and conditions of local contexts and the needs of local communities, and how they envision being church together in the present and in the future, as well as the gifts and the commitments of that a particular preacher might bring to a particular congregation. And I should note as well that many of the shifts and potential futures that I will talk about this morning were already buzzing prior to our great disruptor of COVID. I think we're only at the tip of the iceberg in understanding the impact of COVID and its life and the congregation's church's life after it. But let me also affirm, and this is something I tell my students all the time, is that preaching is still important. In whatever form that it comes, preaching is important in our churches and beyond them. Preaching is a practice that is worthy of consideration because the spoken word holds power, and it holds an important place in our social fabric. When people get up and they speak in front of others, a lot of things can and do happen because of what happens in the communicative moment. Ideas are shaped, heartstrings are plucked, and people's wills are moved because of what happens in the communicative moment. So we might some in the popular sort of culture want to downplay the role of preaching, but when we look around us in the broader culture, we recognize that the spoken word has power to move people to do things like celebrate, take over governmental buildings, fill in the blank, right? The spoken word still has power. So I want to spend our time together this morning talking through three major focus areas when it comes to preaching in the 21st century. And the first is the form of preaching. So first, let's consider form. And I guess I should also say that what I've said already this morning indicates that things are changing, but there's also a tremendous amount of stability in terms of preaching's place. So while we might think about the forms and nature of preaching as changing, we also want to think about how it forms a stable entity in our congregations. So first I want to talk about form. That is to say, how is it that the sermon takes place between preacher and listeners? So we're going to explore three sort of broad categories under the notion of form. The first is what I will call traditional. For better or for worse, let's stick with that language. What I mean by this is probably what comes to mind when you think of preaching or a sermon. The preacher is present in front of a congregation and engages in a monological form of communication. It often looks almost exactly like this, right? My colleague in homiletics, the Reverend Dr. Lise Valle, who teaches preaching and worship at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, calls this form of preaching the mode of the Greco-Roman orator. The mode of the Greco-Roman orator. Because historically, these are the roots of this form of preaching and where it gets its sensibilities for what generally counts as quote-unquote good preaching. So St. Augustine, who was somebody who knew Greco-Roman rhetoric very well, borrowed categories from ancient rhetoric and imported them into the very first preaching handbook. And the qualities that he held up for preaching were teaching should teach, delight, and persuade. Teach, delight, and persuade. These were qualities he ripped off whole cloth from Cicero. And these, in many ways, continue to shape the traditional sensibilities of preaching that many of us have. The preacher speaks, and the people sit in nicely lined rows and take it all in, right? And there is generally very little interaction other than those sort of subtle cues where I see heads nodding or people cocking their heads to the side, right? Very little interaction, especially in predominantly white congregations. But even in African American congregations where listeners engage in what is called call and response, I would still call this mostly a traditional monological form. In the 21st century, this form of preaching is not going to be completely displaced. Why is that? Well, because for many congregations, this tradition matters. It has endured for centuries, and it will continue. It's proven to be a durable form of preaching, even with some shifts in style over the centuries. So for many, this form of preaching matters, and what constitutes the norm against which all other preaching is measured. How it should look, how it should sound, how it should be accomplished, what counts as successful preaching. Congregations committed to this form of preaching do not feel the need for innovation, or they don't know why or how to innovate beyond this traditional form. And I would also say, to add to this, that our congregational architectures have already told us the kind of preaching that is going to endure in a particular space because we've sunk an incredible amount of money into them, right? And this is how it needs to be because this is the building for which preaching is designed, okay? But we might also say because the congregation coming to worship is filled, in many cases now, with new believers or those who are giving church one last try. And as such, they continue to find this format helpful for the kind of relationship that this kind of preaching gives. It helps them build trust with pastors who offer a different way of inhabiting Christian faith, as well as it having a very formational purpose. That would be to provide instruction and affirm beliefs. So this form of preaching is recognizable for many of us, even if the fundamental content is different from the preaching they might have known in other kinds of situations. So the first is traditional. The second is what I'll call hybrid. In this, what we'll see is that we might retain a significant monological aspect to the sermon, at least in many ways, but we're also going to see some divergent practices along the way that shift some of our practices and constraints around preaching. So the first example of this might be what we call roundtable preaching. Has anybody ever heard of this, roundtable preaching? Okay, one of you has. Excellent. In this, the preacher's preparation practice shifts. So I don't know how you imagine your pastors preparing their sermons. I'm guessing it's probably you think they sit in their office and they break out a bunch of books and they read and they write. And that's a very traditional sort of mode of preparation. But in a roundtable preaching process, this moves from preparing fully on their own to more formalized processes that incorporate the voices of others into that sermon preparation process. So usually, this entails a process of a group study in which the preacher does a lot of listening in a group as a biblical text or topic comes to the front of the congregation's attention. The idea here is when this small group meets is that more voices are crowded around the table than just the preacher's own or the commentaries that they study each week, but there's a living interaction in the preparation process. And the idea is to shift some of the authority for preaching into a more representative process. Remember last week we talked about collaborative and more democratic processes and shapes of worship. So this is part of where that comes into play in the preaching process. And in many ways, and depending on the preacher, depending on the tradition, begins to flatten somewhat the authority of the preacher, remove some of the distance and the hierarchy that exists in the preaching process. So it's a recognition of the changing role of ministerial authority for many of us and a changing relationship with the congregation. So rather than the preacher standing on high and just talking to you, a roundtable preaching process is we are talking with one another. And the reason why I say it's a hybrid process is because, well, it still, in the end, ultimately maintains a monological form. So the group doesn't just come up onto the chancel or the dais and speak. It's still the preacher who controls the speaking in its ultimate form. So a dominant metaphor here becomes preaching as conversation. Preaching as conversation. Sermon doesn't just emerge from the preacher and move one way toward the congregation. A second hybrid form takes this even further. Here, conversational preaching manifests within the confines of the worship service rather than just the preparation process. So the preacher's sermon may have monological components or parts, but will also use prompts that lead to live, real, unpredictable responses that come either verbally from the congregation or via digital participation. The idea is to initiate and manifest the sermon as a real-time conversation, one that is open-ended and where the preacher may not have the final word, even if the preacher is making what is called an interpretive wager. That wager is open to being reshaped, contested, or affirmed over the course of the sermon's development in the moment, in that conversation. This might also include pre-planned dialogue sermons between partners. Have you ever seen any dialogue sermons before? It was something that really was kind of first invented in the mid to late 1960s as the death of preaching was hailed in that time. There have been many deaths of preaching that have been hailed throughout time, and it continues to endure. But dialogue sermons are continuing. And then, so a third hybrid form is mostly derived from the second, but could extend out of a roundtable model. Here, the sermon is monological, but it takes place in digital spaces without a traditional congregation. So it might take place via Zoom or Facebook Live or YouTube. And the sermon in this point will be highly participatory for those who are gathered, with the preacher recognizing the contributions and questions that arise during the course of the sermon. So in these hybrid forms, you notice a growing sense of participation from those who are gathered. You can notice a growing sense of collaboration. Why is this? Well, in the second half of the 20th century and forward, there has been, as I've mentioned, a fading sense of the authority of the clergy person as the expert in the room. Long ago, the pastor might have been the most educated person in the room, and maybe even in a community. Those days are long gone. There's been growth in our understanding of the multiplicity of and value of other people's experiences and what they bring to the table. And that those perspectives, those forms of knowledge need to be heard and valued. So these hybrid models respond to that larger sense of responsibility for ministry beyond just the preacher. But there's also a growing number of people who do not want to just come, as I said last week, and sit and soak it all up and receive. Interaction is a value for them. Community is a value for them, and they want to hear and see that in the preaching moment. There's very little that we actually sit and just receive anymore. Very little that does not need our interaction. So these models incorporate that while also holding on to some of the more traditional aspects of preaching. And so the third, I'm using really great terms here, innovative terms. The third and final form is simply what I'll call new. You don't agree with that? You don't think that's a great term? All right. So new, where the preacher is more fully, first a form would be where the preacher is more fully decentralized. And that authority is shared among a wide range of people. So this would result in a fully conversational sermon. One that might be based on a text or a topic, but is more open-ended with many, many voices participating in the moment. Perhaps with the preacher who functions, we might call them as a host of the conversation. But that conversation is more open-ended. No central speaker, as with our two previous forms. Here we might think about dinner church models. Anybody here ever heard of dinner church before? All right, Sandy has. All right, dinner church is exactly that. You gather for dinner, but you also have worship at the same time. And so during sermon times, the conversation, the sermon might be a prompt from the pastor, but the sermon happens around tables as people talk and explore texts together and come to their own kinds of conclusions with some guidance. This might also happen digitally, with like what used to happen on what was formerly called Twitter. There was an exercise called the Slate Project, which happened each and every single week, where a designated leader would pose a question or a prompt on Twitter. And whoever participated in that conversation, which was generally like a 9 p.m. Eastern time to 10 p.m. Eastern time, whoever participated engaged in a digital collaborative sermon there in that moment. And so the proclamation was very much communal. Another manifestation here would be preaching, yes, and you're going to look at me crazy, but that would happen in VR spaces or within digital games with people both in person and remote. So while these might mimic our other form categories, virtual reality or avatar presents a new twist on what it might mean to prepare for preaching, to gather for worship, to be church together. I heard or saw an article the other day that talked about people gathering for worship in the game Minecraft. Yeah, right? So some new digital frontiers for us about where preaching might take place and how that occurs. And what does it mean for us as church to minister within that context, for, to, and with each other? Things that we should probably have on our radar. And then third, I would say proclamation that happens outside the bounds of traditional sermon formats as a replacement for the sermon as we know it in its traditional form. So here we're talking about a regular commitment to forms of drama, poetry, storytelling, film, podcasts, and more. And not just incorporating these into sermons as, hey, look at this cool story or cool illustration, but that as the sermon. So it's important to note that these are rising not just as a gimmick or a way to get new people involved, but to widen the sensibilities that we honor when we talk about proclamation. So there are deep questions of what proclamation is and what it might be beyond the traditional sermon form. Related to that, as I said of my colleague Lise Valle, preaching in the mode of the Greco-Roman order, the sermon as we know it in its traditional form solidified and endured for centuries, and it made use of a very limited range of gifts. Right? The person who can get up and speak well. Right? And in doing so, we overlooked over other modes of proclamation that are just as valid, just as compelling, and that can accomplish many, if not most, if not all of the same purposes, but lift up the gifts of many and even more people. So, form, very important aspect. Let's also move to talking about content as another aspect of the ways that preaching is changing. Of course, the Bible will remain a central conversation partner for preaching. So I'm not gonna work heresy this morning, right? The Bible is going to be central for us. No matter the form, preaching will continue to try to interpret the Bible and its importance for our shared lives together. But what we're seeing now is that if future generations are going to be a part of the church or attend to preaching, then biblical preaching will always need to meet the moment. We'll always need to meet the moment. Gone are the days when we have permission to preach solely about Jesus and me. Yay, nice and sweet. So let me make my way through a few of these major concerns that lie before us and that preachers will need to wrestle with, no matter how you may feel about them. Okay? So, a few of these content issues. You see a list up here. It's certainly not an exhaustive list. So first would be biblical interpretation through minoritized lenses. So meaning that preachers today are going to need to and are taking up the experiences of those who come from minoritized places and minoritized experiences. We might think here about race and ethnicity, about geographical location, disabilities, gender, and many, many more, right? So one of the things that preachers are taking up more often now, and in fact I have a requirement in the work that my students do for me, is that they have to consult commentaries about a text that come from lenses that are underrepresented groups, minoritized communities. So these are places where we're paying much more attention. The second is climate crisis. Again, no matter how you feel about climate crisis, it is something that our world is very much curious about, very much interested in. Pope Francis has been active in thinking through and talking through climate crisis. And if our preaching does not address the concerns around the climate, then we are missing a significant window into what is going on in our world, right? And if we take a look at our scriptures, they are deeply concerned about and appreciate creation. So we do have something to offer the world here. The third would be LGBTQIA plus inclusion and belonging. As we know just widely in our culture, this is a place where continued discrimination, oppression, and violence are happening, and we have a word to bring about that, and people are hungry to hear about that from pulpits. Fourth would be economic issues. We live in a world where the disparity between rich and poor is ever widening, and the economy is at the heart of the Bible. And the range of the Bible to talk about economic issues is pretty wide. And our world very much needs to make sense and wants to make sense of the economic issues that are in front of us. Fifth would be racial and ethnic realities and tensions. In the past, our pulpits have shied away from addressing racism and the ways that ethnic conflict and ethnic violence seems to happen. And so there's an ever-growing demand for us to speak a word that speaks into the racial and ethnic tensions and realities in which we live. The sixth would be Christian nationalism, a topic about which we hear so much more over the past 5 years or so. The ways that nationalism and Christianity the lines have seemed to have blurred between them for many. And of course, our political divisions. People are anxious to hear a word from the church and from our pulpits about how divided we are and how we can recover our sense of healing with one another. The seventh would be a multi-religious world. So we have more information and more interaction with people who come from other religious traditions than I think we ever have before. And so how is it that we make sense of who we are as Christians in a world that values the religious traditions of so many? And so preaching can offer a way to be conversant in the realities of a multi-religious world. The eighth would be the persistent and systemic traumas that we know. If we're thinking about different forms of violence in our world, or even natural disasters that occur as traumas. And then finally, isolation and loneliness. We are in a world that is more connected and more wired than we have ever been. And in a sense, we live in a smaller world, and yet we feel more and more distant from one another. Many of us do. So how is it that preaching can offer a pastoral word that speaks into the midst of that? There are probably more that you might add here, and maybe we'll pick up some of those, or you might have questions about them. We'll pick up some of those when we have a Q&A. But let me speak briefly about what all this means. It means, and hold on to your seats, it means that preaching is political. Now, before you throw me out the door, let me explain what I mean by that. Preaching is political, and that is an unavoidable fact, because all preaching is political. What I don't mean is that preaching is partisan, in that we promote a political party or a political stance or endorsing particular candidates. Oftentimes, when people are afraid of preaching being political, that's what they mean, that we're going to endorse someone or take up the posture of a particular political party. Other times, when they accuse preachers of being political, it just means that the preacher addressed an important topic in the pulpit and they didn't like what the preacher said about that. So here's what I mean by preaching being political. What I mean is this. Anytime a preacher invites a congregation to consider how it is to love God with their heart, soul, mind, and strength, you may have heard that somewhere before, and how to love their neighbor as themselves, maybe that rings a bell too, we are entering the realm of the political. That is to say, we are entering the realm of considering what it means in tangible ways to live in community with one another, and how we will do that with intention. The origin of the word politics, as many of you know, is polis, the Greek word meaning the city. Christianity is a political faith because we proclaim who as Lord? That's your gimme question for the morning. Jesus. Yeah, him. And we use that term Lord, which is a political title. And when we proclaim Jesus as Lord, we are saying that others and other people and other systems are not. When we proclaim that God is love, then that means something about how you and I make our way through the world we inhabit. When we read about God's intervention in human affairs through the material reality of Jesus, we know about a God who interferes in political atmospheres. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus, a political figure, that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius, another political figure, was governor of Syria. This is Luke chapter 2. And when we read the words of Jesus, who appropriated the words of the prophet Isaiah to say, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, Luke 4. We enter into a faith that calls us into a radical commitment and solidarity, and calls us to think about the ways that our faith manifests in tangible ways in the polis, in the city. Luke Powery, who is dean of the Duke Chapel and professor of preaching at Duke Divinity School, puts it this way, and I quote, "A worshiping community may gather, hear the word proclaimed, respond to that word, but then are sent into the world to scatter good news lavishly all over it. Preaching in the pulpit is a beginning that leads to proclamation of the gospel in the world by living it out in word and deed. It is a reminder that there is always the go principle in the life of faith, including preaching. Jesus may say come sometimes, but he also says go. Preaching must go beyond the narrow confines of privatism and into all the world, the highways and byways of life, following the God enfleshed in Jesus Christ, who did the same in love. God loved the world, so God got political, Powery says. And that is in his essay, Is Preaching Political? Now, will many congregations and preachers and congregants disagree? Yes, and maybe you do too. They will choose what Powery calls, quote, privatism. And I think that's dangerous ground. And that preaching should open, not close, conversations about what it means to live out our faith, to bring our faith into conversation with the range of issues that affect all of our daily lives and that intervene in our lives. So now that I've ruffled your feathers, let's go to the third category, and then we'll make our way towards some Q&A. I know we're making our way toward the end of our time. So let me say just a few words about style before some concluding remarks. First, in terms of style, preaching will increasingly become more multimedia in nature. We live in a world in which speech, music, image, light, sound, and beat are all interspersed in communicative situations, either simultaneously or in succession, from TV to movies to social media to multiple forms of our social gatherings. This is the communicative waters in which we all swim. And so we can expect that preaching will continue to experiment with effectively using multimedia. I don't know how you are set up here. I think that's probably minimal here, right, in a more traditional space. But many congregations are moving in this way to continue to experiment with multimedia. Second, I think just simply we will see preachers engage in multiple sermon styles. In ways that previous generations of preachers did not, preachers now recognize that the same form of preaching week to week, you may think of the 3 points in a poem. Any of you grow up with that? I see heads nodding that you did. In the same way that can become stale from week to week to week to week to week, so on and so forth. It misses people who appreciate and who have different listening styles. That kind of same week in and week out preaching in the same form doesn't represent the wide diversity of biblical texts that are before us and how they communicate, as well as the differences among us. So I think as the years go on, we're going to experience a wider variety of sermon forms, styles. Some will engage in more storytelling and story-informed approaches, while some will engage in more denotative styles where clarity and teaching are necessary and appreciated. So whether it's multimedia or sermon structures and styles, preachers are not trying to be more engaging or entertaining, at least if their motives are pure. Instead, they're seeking to offer a gospel word in the fullest range of expressions as possible in order to meet the most people as they can. So, some concluding comments, and then we will have some time for conversation. So first, let me say this. Preaching is hard work. I don't know if you think about that from time to time, but it is hard work. It is complex work. I don't know how often you think about what it might take to preach each week, but I would encourage you to talk with your pastoral staff about their preparation process at some point to get an insider's view at what it takes to preach each week in this setting. There are a lot of expectations that preachers place on themselves, and of course that are placed upon them by individual congregants. So I'd encourage you to be honest with yourself and with your pastors. It's hard work to go to the biblical text each week and live into all those expectations, as well as all of the needs that are before us, especially in a world that's as complex as the one in which we live right now. Second, I would say we're still trying to figure it out all over again. From pre-2016 and the significant events that happened then, to post-2016, to pre-pandemic, to wherever we are in pandemic, there have been a lot of shifts in our culture and in our churches. And we know now, even better than we did before, that our context can change at a moment's notice. So we preachers are trying to keep up, to get out in front of and anticipate other shifts to come, and at the same time not to leave anyone behind who just wants things to stay the way they are. So to reiterate, preaching in the 21st century, and we're almost a quarter of the way through it at this point, so it still feels odd. It feels right to say preaching in the 21st century, but it also feels odd. It will have multiple futures. And I hope that you will have lively conversations about the form and the content and the style of preaching for many years to come as a way of enriching your common life together. And even more, I hope that you will have life-transforming encounters with the Holy One through preaching. And I think that's part of the reason we gather, is at least somewhere in us we think that that transforming moment might occur in the moments in which the word is spoken and we are attentive to it. So I'll stop there and see what kinds of questions and engagement you might have. I'm getting into, Sandy was like ready to go. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so thanks for that. I think to summarize, Sandy, what Sandy was saying, that post-2018, when you retired to the seminary, our world just happens so rapid fire. And preachers may have been done with a sermon for that particular week, and yet something happens and people come to church with so much on their mind. I'm not. So I'll say this, Sandy. I think I was my first year of seminary was 2001, and I remember sitting outside of my Old Testament introduction class, and a professor had the radio on when the World Trade Center attacks happened. For me, the world of preaching changed that day in a way that I think maybe it was significantly different than some of my colleagues who had come before me. So I always have that running in the back of my mind, that the world has changed and continues to change and can change at a moment's notice. So one of the ways I try to teach is to try to give students the best tools that they can. And we talk about what I call pastoral spidey sense. That is to know when things are changed and changing in such a way that they need to shift their own practices. Because you could wear yourself out trying to pivot to whatever is going on in the world each and every week, whether it happens on Monday or Saturday night, right? To be able to address in preaching and beyond preaching the range of things that happen in our world. So thanks, and that's my response. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Others? Yes. Uh-oh. Okay. Yeah. Great. I'll start with your second and then move my way back to your first. No, I don't think there's a difference. I think that's the goal, right? Transformation of our individual selves and our communities around us into the shape and form and image of what Jesus called the kingdom of God, the reign, the rule, realm of God. That for me is, and I think always will be, the goods of preaching, right? To answer your first, yes, there are some similarities. So with the roundtable model, you might do it under the guise of a Bible study, right? But rather than the Bible studying being the end unto itself, for roundtable preaching, the Bible study serves the moments of proclamation, right? So there might be these moments of insight and transformation that happen within the Bible study, and they stay within that group. But in roundtable preaching, what happens is those insights, with permission, get moved into the pulpit, and those voices that are present in that moment are represented in the preaching moment by the preacher who's still engaging in this sort of monological form of preaching. So yes, roundtable conversations do oftentimes look very much like Bible studies, but they have different purposes and ends to them rather than just ending with the Bible study moment. Did that answer your question? Great. Others? Yes, in the back. Where is the Catholic Church going from here? I would say there has been, since Vatican II, a real reclamation of the role of preaching in the Catholic Church. And that's a battle they're still fighting with emerging priests, is how to equip and bolster the importance of preaching in Catholic settings, Roman Catholic settings. I've just had some interaction with Roman Catholic folks who are doing a weekly podcast of best sermons in the Roman Catholic tradition as a way to sort of bolster and support and encourage good preaching in Roman Catholic settings. So it's there. It's still short. It's still not the most important thing that they do, but there are a lot of people who are trying to make a concerted effort to improve preaching in Catholic settings and raise the importance of it. Yeah, you're welcome. Yes, sir.
If you look at the overall decline of Presbyterian, active Presbyterian participation in our lifetime, what does that say about the effectiveness of preaching over that window of time?
That's a great question. I would say, I think we should, I'm not Presbyterian, but I'll talk in the we. I think, because I'm mainline Protestant too, and that's certainly not just a Presbyterian problem, we should have taken heed of some of these hybrid forms longer, further back in our past. We should have anticipated them. And preachers should not have felt so impressed with their own voices. Did I put that mildly? They should have not been so impressed with their own voices, and so divorced from some of the realities that I'd named and the realities that preceded us, in such a way that the pulpit came divorced from the realities of our lives in many ways. And I think those who have drifted away or who have not been interested have said, in this activity, I do not see a word for the pressing realities of my life. Even in congregations that are moderate or progressive leaning, they would say, you've not talked about the realities of my life and the realities in a world in a way that addresses them acutely and helps me to interpret them and to live responsibly into them. Is that true for everybody? I'm not saying that across the board. I just described your children? Yeah. Yeah. I think that's it. Yeah. Yes. Sure. Mm-hmm. Sure. Sure. So I think the thing to say here is that this list is not the 9-week list that gets repeated over and over and over again, right? So, okay. Well, okay. What I will say is that I think there are and should be a range of issues. I lifted up 9, right? And I said that this is suggestive and not exhaustive, right? So I would encourage all preachers, and do encourage all preachers, to engage in what's called local theology. And that is discerning what are the things that are going on in the community and in people's everyday lives, to which we all need to be attentive, to think about how we interpret those and how we live into them. So I think there's room for both this and for the recharging of batteries, because I agree with you that is important, right? Mm-hmm.
And I was looking for a because I do need that over and every month ago. Probably the first time someone come in, I want to go to the club.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing I'll add to that is that both for that last piece of what you said and in the back, I would say that preaching can't do everything, right? Yeah. So maybe we need to also soften our expectations in some ways of preaching, as important as it is in our life, in our collective life. Thank you for that. Others? Yes. I wish the Apostle Paul had never said that. Yeah. Sure. I think that's a good thing. Yeah. And I would say that's also up to staffs. And now here we're getting outside the boundaries of preaching, but that's okay. Each congregation has to continue in its discernment about who we are and what's our identity in this community and what has changed in our world and what needs to change in our mission and our witness in the community. And then, of course, the corollary to that in terms of preaching is how is it that we line up our preaching with that changing and shifting identity in terms of what the community wants and needs around us. Not in a way that's wishy-washy, right? There will always, I think, be some core things that a congregation will hold on to. But how is it that we remain contextual and relevant in a society that needs us to be that, and where we want our witness to be one that is full and meets the needs of the community in front of us. Thank you. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Happy Easter to you. Thank you so much.